In the royal chamber, she collapses in unbearable pain, unable to move, while the court expects the vampire king to finish her. Instead, he shocks everyone by lifting her into his arms and using his own ancient power to heal her, even at a deadly cost. That single choice ignites a forbidden bond and exposes a betrayal that could shatter his throne. The palace learned your footsteps the way a river learns stones, by listening, by remembering, by never admitting it aloud. Mara had been walking the same corridor for 3 seasons now, from the human servants' wing to the herb rooms, from the herb rooms to the linen stairs, and back again before the lamps were lowered for the day. The palace belonged to the night, and to the king who ruled it, but the work of keeping it gentle enough for living people happened in the thin hours when sunlight still clung to the high windows and the stone floors were only cold, not cruel. That morning, the cold seemed to have found her bones anyway. She paused at the base of the eastern stair with a basket of clean bandages pressed to her hip. The basket was not heavy. It was the stair that felt heavy, step after step rising like a question she couldn't answer. She tested her right foot on the first step and felt the familiar pinch in her knee, the old injury that never fully healed, waking up as if it had been waiting for the sound of her breath. Not today, she whispered to herself, because if she let it become a negotiation, the pain always won. She climbed slowly, hand sliding along the carved rail. Above her, the palace was quiet, just the hush of curtains moving in a draught, the faint drip of water somewhere behind the walls, the distant murmur of a fountain that never froze. It should have been peaceful. It usually was. But there were mornings, like this one, when the calm felt like a test. At the top landing, Mara stopped and pressed her forehead to the cool stone for a moment, letting her breath settle. She didn't want anyone to see how hard it was. Human servants did not earn their place here by being fragile. They earned it by being steady. A soft voice drifted from the linen room doorway. "You early." Thomas stood there with a folded sheet in his arms, dark hair mussed, eyes already tired. He had the kind of tired that came from worrying before anything bad had even happened. "Or you're late," Mara said, trying for lightness. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Anwan says they are counting supplies again. The steward is in a mood." They both knew what that meant. Lord Rexon, the palace steward, was not cruel in the way stories outside the walls imagine vampires to be. He did not shout. He did not strike. He simply decided, in his quiet voice, what was necessary, and the necessary thing always seemed to cost a human more than it cost anyone else. Mara adjusted the basket against her hip. "We'll keep our heads down." Thomas's gaze flicked to her knee, and he immediately looked away, as if seeing it too clearly would make it worse. "Your leg?" "It's fine," she said. She made herself smile. "It always argues in the morning and then behaves by noon." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "If the steward asks, tell him you were with me the whole time." "Why would he ask?" Thomas hesitated. "Because a silver lamp went missing from the gallery last night. The one with the moonstones. They are saying a human couldn't resist taking it." Mara's stomach tightened, not from fear of punishment but from something quieter, the exhaustion of being the first suspect simply because she was ordinary and breakable. "A lamp," she repeated, as if naming it might shrink it into something harmless. "Maybe a page moved it." "Pages don't get blamed," Thomas said. Mara wanted to tell him that truth mattered anyway. She wanted to believe that if you did your work carefully and spoke honestly, the world would meet you halfway. But she had lived inside these walls long enough to know that truth was not always the currency people used. Sometimes they used convenience. She set the basket down on the linen table and began sorting bandages into neat stacks, her hands moving with the calm precision she had learned here. Order was a kind of prayer. It was something she could offer even when her knee hurt and her heart felt small. Behind the palace's grandeur, Mara's life was made of such small offerings. She rose before the night court retreated. She brewed teas that helped human lungs in the cold halls. She dried winter herbs on racks warmed by hidden vents. She mended torn cuffs and carried sealed jars of salve to the physicians. It was quiet work, rarely noticed, but it mattered. She had decided that her dignity would not depend on being seen. It would depend on being faithful to what she could do. There were mysteries in the palace that Mara never spoke of aloud, how the chandeliers brightened without hands to light them, how certain doors opened only for certain bloodlines, how the shadows in the king's gallery seemed to shift even when no candle moved. But the greatest mystery, to Mara, was simpler: why the vampire king kept human servants at all. Most people outside imagine vampires as hunters who kept no company but their own. Yet here, in this palace carved from pale stone and built around a garden that only bloomed at dusk, humans lived and worked and grew older. The king's presence was felt everywhere, his crest on the banners, his laws in the rules that shaped every day, yet Mara had seen him only a handful of times, always from a distance, always framed by archways like a figure in a painting. When she did see him, it was never with fear exactly. It was with the same careful respect one gives a storm seen far out at sea, powerful, distant, and not personally interested in you. The day moved on. Mara carried bandages to the infirmary, where Sister Anwen, who was not a sister by vow but by manner, was grinding dried leaf into powder. Anwen looked up as Mara entered. Her hair was silver and braided tightly, her sleeves always rolled as if the work was never finished. She had served in this palace longer than anyone Mara knew. No one knew why she stayed. No one dared ask. "You're limping more," Anwen said, not unkindly. "It's the weather," Mara replied, setting down the bandages. Anwen's eyes narrowed the way they did when she didn't believe someone but decided not to argue yet. "The steward will call the household together today. Be steady. Be honest. Don't be dramatic." Mara almost laughed, because drama was the last thing she knew how to do. "I've never been dramatic a day in my life." Anwen snorted softly. "Good. The palace does not reward drama. It rewards endurance." That word, endurance, settled in Mara's chest like a stone. She had endured plenty before she came here: a father lost to winter illness, a village that treated her injury like a weakness rather than a wound, a choice between being a burden and being useful. She had chosen usefulness. But she was beginning to wonder if endurance was meant to be her whole life. By mid-afternoon, the household was summoned to the long gallery where the tall windows made the light feel thin and silver. Humans stood in rows near the back. Vampires, stewards, pages, attendants, stood closer to the center, composed as marble. Everyone's voices were low, as if the palace itself might be listening. Lord Rexon stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. His expression was polite in the way a locked door is polite. "The moonstone lamp from the western gallery is missing," he said. "It was last seen before midnight. This item does not belong to the household. It belongs to the crown." Mara's fingers curled around the edge of her apron. She kept her gaze forward. "We will not accuse without cause," Rexon continued, "but we will not ignore the obvious. Humans move through these halls without being seen. Humans have families outside these walls who imagine jewels might buy them comfort." A soft ripple of discomfort passed through the human line. Mara felt it like a draft. Rexon's eyes moved across the servants as if he were selecting tools. Then they stopped on Thomas. "You were assigned to the Western Gallery last night," he said. Thomas swallowed. "Yes, my lord. I finished the dusting before the bell." "You were alone?" "No, my lord. Mara brought the cloths." "She?" Rexon raised a hand, silencing him without effort. "We will not have confusion. The question is simple. Did you touch the lamp?" Thomas shook his head quickly. "No." Rexon's gaze sharpened. "Then someone else did. Someone who had reason." Mara's mind raced through the last day. She remembered passing the Western Gallery at dusk, carrying jars of chamomile. She remembered a young vampire page, barely older than a human boy, standing on a step stool, adjusting curtains because the king preferred them to fall a certain way. The page had bumped the display table. The lamp had wobbled. Mara had paused, heart-catching, but the page had steadied it with a careless laugh and moved on. Except, no. Mara remembered something else now, a small detail she had not bothered to name at the time. The page had lifted the lamp afterward and carried it toward the alcove near the musician's stand, muttering about better light for the evening. It would have been nothing, if nothing had gone missing. Rexon was speaking again, voice calm. "If the lamp is not returned by nightfall, privileges will be restricted. Human movement will be limited. Rations will be reassessed." Anwan's warning came back to Mara. "Be steady, be honest, don't be dramatic." Mara felt the moral pressure settle on her like a cloak made of lead. It would be easier to remain silent. It would be safer. Thomas could protest, but protests from humans were often interpreted as guilt. She imagined Thomas dismissed, sent back beyond the palace walls with nothing but his worn coat and the knowledge that honesty hadn't saved him. She imagined him standing in the snow with nowhere to go. Mara's voice rose before she could talk herself out of it. "My lord," she said. The gallery quieted so suddenly that Mara heard her own breath. Lord Rexon turned his head slowly. His eyes, dark and reflective, rested on her, and Mara felt the weight of being looked at by someone who had lived too long to be easily moved. "Yes," he said, as if indulging a child. Mara swallowed. Her knee throbbed, perhaps from standing too stiffly. She kept her spine straight anyway. Dignity was sometimes nothing more than posture when fear tried to fold you. "I passed the Western Gallery at dusk yesterday," she said carefully. "I saw Page Leo lift the lamp from the table. He said he wanted more light near the musician's alcove for the evening." A pause. Not outrage. Not disbelief. Just silence, the kind that measures you. Mara continued, gentler now. "It may have been returned afterward. I cannot say. But if it was moved, it was not Thomas." Rexon's gaze flicked, briefly, toward the cluster of pages. The young vampire Leo looked up, startled, then flushed in a way vampires did not often do. His mouth opened, shut, then opened again. I did move it," Leo admitted, voice small. "Only for a moment. I thought it belonged to the gallery. I meant to set it back. Later I couldn't remember which table. Rexon's expression did not change. You are certain? Yes, my lord. The tension in the human line loosened in a shaky wave. Thomas let out a breath Mara could almost feel. Lord Rexon regarded Mara again. You risk much by speaking, he said, tone still mild. Humans are advised to remain quiet when nobles are questioned. Mara's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. It felt wrong to let blame fall where it didn't belong. A murmur ran through the vampires now, not hostile, more surprised, as if they were not used to hearing a human speak in that way, without pleading. Rexon inclined his head, barely. The lamp will be searched for. Page Leo will assist. Thomas will return to work. He paused. And Mara, be mindful. Not every truth is welcomed. The gathering dispersed in controlled quiet. Thomas caught Mara's sleeve as they left. You didn't have to, he whispered, his voice rough with relief. Mara's hands trembled now that it was over, delayed fear shaking loose. I did, she whispered back. I couldn't stand there and let it happen. She expected consequences. A reassignment to colder halls, perhaps. Fewer privileges. A note in a ledger beside her name that might one day be used against her. Instead, the consequence came in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her body, finally pushed too hard, chose that moment to remind her that courage did not make her unbreakable. As she crossed the threshold into the next corridor, the ache in her knee surged sharply upward, locking the joint as if the bones had decided to refuse each other. Pain shot through her leg and stole the corridor out from under her. The world tilted, and the basket she had picked up earlier slipped from her fingers, bandages spilling like pale ribbons across the stone. Mara reached for the wall, but her hand slid on polished marble. Her breath caught in her chest. For a heartbeat she couldn't make sound. Then, very softly, almost ashamed of it, she managed, I can't move. It hurts. Voices around her blurred. Feet stopped. Someone said her name. Someone else hissed for space. Mara kept her eyes on the floor because it felt easier than facing the fact that she had become a problem in public. A shadow fell across the spilled bandages, longer than the others, edged by the hem of a dark cloak. The corridor had entered more slowly than usual because the King's Council had been passing through the adjoining hall, and now the air seemed to thicken with attention. Mara didn't need to look up to know what presence had arrived. The palace had a way of tightening when he was near, like a room holding its breath. The Vampire King stood a few paces away, not close enough to loom, but close enough that everyone else stepped back as if drawn by an invisible cord. Mara lifted her gaze despite herself. He was as she remembered, pale as carved bone, hair dark, expression unreadable. His crown was simple, no dramatics, no glitter, just metal shaped into restraint. His eyes passed over Mara the way one might look at a tear in cloth, not with contempt, but with consideration, as if measuring what it would take to mend. Lord Rexon began, Your Majesty, the servant. The king lifted a gloved hand, and the steward fell silent instantly. For a moment, the king did nothing. Mara's knee pulsed. Her pride pulsed with it. The corridor was full of watching faces, some curious, some impatient, some uneasy at the sight of a human collapsed like a dropped tool. Mara forced herself to speak again, quieter now. I'm sorry, she said, not because she believed she had done wrong, but because apologies were the language of survival. The king's gaze settled on her, steady and distant. When he spoke, his voice was calm enough to be almost gentle. "Do not apologize for pain," he said. "Pain is not insolence." It was such a simple sentence that it stunned the corridor more than any threat could have. Even Anwen, who had pushed through the crowd with her sleeves already rolled, paused. The king turned slightly. "A chair," he said to no one in particular. A vampire attendant moved at once, fetching a padded seat from a nearby alcove. Another attendant reached toward Mara as if to lift her, but the king spoke again, firm without raising his voice.